What if I were to tell you that between 95 and 98% of white Americans' ancestors could not possibly have come into the country in any wrong way, thereby invalidating the concept that our ancestors came into this country the right way, the right way? Something you'd be hearing around the Thanksgiving dinner table this year, as many from your racist uncles. My name's Chris. And on this channel, I remember things because someone has to. It's possible that many of you have seen my video titled 10 Million White Americans' Ancestors Came Across the Border Illegally, something to that effect. There'll be a link at the end of this video. And in that, we examined the roughly 10 million Americans who identify as white, who have at least one ancestor, who crossed the pre-Canadian U.S. border illegally, purposefully, to do an end around any migration checks whatsoever with the U.S. government, which I thought was a good rejoinder to the notion that there were these there are these mythical Americans who came in the right way. I was looking really to poke with a stick at the notion that there weren't any people who came in the wrong way, although there clearly were. But I think that we need to have a video just to examine more closely and have a remembering of the fact that there was virtually no wrong way for white people to enter the United States throughout almost the entire bulk of American history. Between 95 and 98% of the ancestral background of current white Americans took place in an era when there was an open borders policy for people by dint of being European, by dint of being white, and that this even continued after the open borders policy with preferential quotas and so forth. So I've been up to my neck in Immigration and Naturalization Service, the forerunner of ICE statistics, the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization Statistics even earlier. For the longest time, there aren't really overly many statistics to be had. From 1607, from the founding of English-speaking colonies on the eastern seaboard, up through 1875, there was basically no federal immigration law whatsoever. There were really informal arrangements in which private carriers, private shipping carriers would try not to carry contagious people, if for no other reason than the crews themselves didn't want to get ill. But pretty much upon arrival, virtually everybody was admitted. There was the 1798 Alien and Sedition Act, which was supposed to have the ability, give the U.S. government the ability to deport foreigners, but as we'll see, there were virtually no deportations of any sort for the longest time, at least not for white people, and we'll be getting there. There were essentially zero effective barriers for white Americans to enter the United States. We can say that in 1875 there was an attempt made at some form of immigration reform or immigration tightening with something called the Page Act. And these were federal laws that largely were aimed at Chinese laborers. This is a precursor to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, which specifically barred Chinese people from entering the United States up through World War II. But it was also aimed at, quote, lunatics, idiots, or persons likely to become a public charge. And Europeans almost never fell into consideration of these categories. That takes us from 1607 until 1891. There were virtually no deportations. I did get into the other video about how there was what was called a voluntary remigration program, let us call it, that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had specifically for Irish Catholics to discriminate against them, however, rarely used, and there were rarely any such things as deportations. We could ask, what could get a person excluded or deported? Well, in theory, owing to a series of acts that were passed in 1875, 1891, 1903, 1907, and 1917, there was supposed to be a tightening, but as we'll see, this really basically did not happen at all for immigrants. Feeble-mindedness was supposed to be a cause for exclusion, and this was done by line inspection. Immigrants were in a line, they were being processed coming into a port, and a public health service doctor was supposed to watch for physical signs such as odd gait, vacant stare, drooling, and the inability to follow simple commands. Yes, they were checking to see if your great-great-grandfather was a drooler. Now, here's the thing. Basically what happened up until about 1917 is that if your great-great-grandfather was a potted plant and basically a drooler and was white, what they would do is they'd put a chalk mark maybe on his coat and pull him over to the side and do further questioning to determine exactly how feeble-minded he was. This could involve holding up a few fingers and asking in an appropriate language, how many fingers was it? So it's possible that your great-great-grandfather managed to identify 3 fingers as 3. It's possible that they asked him to button his coat, see if he could button his own coat. That was part of the barrier to entry in the United States for your white ancestors in many cases. So what we could say, therefore, is that your great-great-grandfather Joseph may have been a sheep-buggering, potted plant, drooling moron, but he was white, and he could button his vest like a goddamn champ. So this might be what one of your Thanksgiving table relatives is referring to as coming into the country the right way. I'm not sure exactly what it is that most indignant racist uncles around the Thanksgiving table think was happening precisely with their relatives, with their ancestors, which made them special to be admitted. There seems to be some concept that they were writing admissions essays, like they were trying to get into Yale, or that they were solving a Rubik's Cube in 45 seconds or less, or that, I don't know, that they were doing the NFL Combine, something like that. But really, basically, it was somebody looking at you and saying, white, and then beyond that, they would say, okay, did they have any obviously contagious diseases? If so, mark them with some chalk and bring them off to the side, and then we'll exclude them. But those exclusions were primarily temporary. It turns out that in the vast majority of exclusions for those reasons, people were put off to the side for a 20 to 90-day quarantine period and then just let in anyway. This seems to have been about 90% of the people who were initially excluded were admitted in the let's say 1870s to through the 1890s period, and then this drops when they started to have the crackdown on immigration. This drops to about 40% of people being admitted after a period of exclusion, which may have been the result of a health check and a quarantine, or could have been an exclusion for some other reason, which was taken to an immigration court at the facility. And again, it looks like we started off even admitting 90% of the people who were initially excluded, and then that drops to a low of about 40% of the excluded. As we're going to see, these are very low numbers by the time you get to around 1930. So again, just white skin, white face was basically your entree. There was no such thing as a visa until after 1924. There was a major reorganization of U.S. immigration in the year 1924 with the creation of the U.S. Border Patrol. There was no U.S. Border Patrol until 1924. We'll get to that shortly. And there was no such thing as getting a visa to be admitted prior to 1924. Nor would I argue was there in 1924 yet. because you had the act passed to create these organizations, but then you had to hire and staff them and train and come up with a procedure and so forth, and communicate with embassies and consulates if you were looking for people to get visas ahead of time for travel. So I would argue it was probably well into the 1920s before it was even a possibility for anybody to show up the right way. The right way to show up was to be white and to show up. Another way that you could be excluded would be political radicalism. Well, how would you tell if somebody was a political radical? This was especially the case from 1903 on, after the assassination of William McKinley by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz. And you would say, well, that's ridiculous. How are you going to weed out political radicals? What would you do? You're going to ask them? And that's exactly what happened. People were asked, are you a radical? People were asked the questions, are you an anarchist? Because as we know, if there's one thing that anarchists hate to do, it's to lie to a government official. They would never do that. Another question is, do you believe in the overthrow of the U.S. government by force? Which seems a loaded question. I mean, define force. There would also be the question, are you a polygamist? They wanted to exclude polygamists, despite the fact that we had our homegrown. And the way that they would ask that is, are you a polygamist? Do you have more than one wife? Which, of course, you could also just lie about. And my personal favorite question, do you advocate assassination of public officials? Which is, again, define advocate. And I will admit, if somebody asked me that at a border, I might have to pause. I've been trying to picture who the person is who would be excluded by these questions. I think they would have to say something like, good day, Amerykański immigration official. I am Szkabnan. I and my many wives come across the sea to have many radical babies to shoot your President Benjamin Harrison. And basically, if you did something short of that, then I think you were just in the cha-cha line of immigrants. Let's take a look at how unlikely it was for anybody to be excluded. Now, there are no statistics for this prior to 1891 because they basically were excluding such a negligible amount of people that there wasn't even a collection of statistics, and things were not even the federal government cared so little up through 1891 that there was no federal organization or standards for ports. It was mostly left up to local port officials and states who were generally just admitting people. So we see in 1891 there were 560,319 immigrants admitted, and there are no statistics for any of them being either excluded or deported. In 1892, there were 455,620 admitted. There were 1,125 excluded, but as reviewed, that's initial exclusion, and perhaps as many as 90% of them were then admitted. Some of these people were being excluded and deported, sent back immediately on the ship simply because they were Chinese. So again, that's including the Chinese. In other words, there was a 0.2% chance. Looking at the cumulative totals of all of the people admitted between 1891 and 1900, there were just over 3 million immigrants admitted, 3,070,669, and the number excluded, at least initially, was 9,720, meaning that there was a 0.259% chance of your initial exclusion. The number of people deported in the entire decade from 1891 through 1900, and we'll get into why those people would have been deported, was 26,631 versus 5 million. that means that there is a 0.8% chance of somebody in that decade being deported. And we'll get into who those people were earlier, but in other words, you had basically a better than 99% chance of coming in and staying if you were white in that 1890s decade, when first we have any variety whatever of statistics. We see that this holds pretty steady through 1910. There's a 1% chance of anybody being either deported or excluded, the two together. And then I see cumulative 1930. I ran the numbers in which, if you look at 1891 through 1930, now that's including when things get tougher after 1924, when they actually did start to have some quotas, and these quotas again favored people from northern, western, and central Europe. 1930 cumulative, so 1892 through 1930, there were 21,637,669 immigrants admitted, and the number excluded, at least initially, was 56,207, which means that there was a 0.259% chance that you could be excluded. The deportations were 0.33, so a 1/3 of 1% chance of being deported up through 1930. And of course, if you're looking at from the time of British colonies up through 1930, there was I don't even know. There's probably a less than 1/10 of 1% chance of anybody being deported for any reason, so long as they were white. Only now, you may be saying, "But my parents came over in 1950." I don't doubt that they did. I'm from a neighborhood in Philadelphia that is traditionally has been majority Italian American for a few generations, and there are certainly people who arrived from Calabria in 1950. There are some areas, primarily in northeastern cities in the United States, with more traditional neighborhoods where you do have up to 15% of the white population has roots that are post-1924 arrivals. So it's then you're talking about 85% of the white population came in during the open borders policy. Their ancestors came in that period. And I'm not saying that those folks don't exist. You're mostly talking then about Slavs, Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, for the most part, in those communities, but they remain less than 5% of the overall total of the white majority in the United States. If you're at the Thanksgiving table and your relatives are insisting that our ancestors came in the right way, you might ask if there's some Chinese or Japanese background that you have. I congratulate you if you're a Chinese American whose family came in 4 or 5 generations ago, because they certainly did come in the right way, considering that there was a 20 to 90% rejection rate for Chinese and Japanese immigrants into the United States, given the Chinese Exclusion Act and what was called the Gentleman's Agreement. So you can always, when your indignant uncle has the spittle going with that they came in the right way, you could say, I didn't know. I did not realize that we had some Chinese background in the family. Is that why Uncle Frank's hair is so dark? It all makes sense now. Thanksgiving dinner table, having your MAGA hat fueled rage conversation about immigration. What's going to happen is there's going to be huffing and puffing and but what about the criminals? The criminals need to get deported, and times were different, things were better, times were different. Well, no, they weren't. Because the fact of the matter is, and I have the statistics to prove it, that white criminals were very specifically allowed to remain in the United States in the vast majority of cases. In fact, it gets even better. In many cases, you had to be a criminal to enter the United States. So let's look at that. First off, we might like to look at the British colonies that were used as places to dump convicts. Not just talking about Australia, which is more famous, but the American colonies, very especially Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Between the years 1718 and 1776, an estimated 50 to 60,000 prisoners were sentenced to transportation to the American colonies for a variety of crimes. It looks like about 70% of that was larceny, which was basically theft, and a variety of other charges could get you deported to the United States. And about 75% of those people, despite the fact life being hard, about 75% of them did survive to the age where they would procreate. It is currently, I did some digging, and it looks like about 1 to 2% of white Americans, especially concentrated, at least originally in the Maryland and Virginia area, are descended from, at least in part, from people who were in the United States because they were prisoners, not despite being criminal, but because they were judged to be criminal. So if that's how your family is defining and recounting with pride, coming in the right way, you go for it. Fly your freak flag. Don't let me get in your way. But it just seems like that's relevant and perhaps something that we should remember as opposed to ignore. Now, the counter to that around the Thanksgiving table is going to be the indignant racist uncle who's going to say, but what about the ones that came over and then they were criminals and then they were deported? Well, not really. Not if they were white. You see, in the year 1880, the United States had a census of prisoners, and it was estimated that between 42 and 45% of those who were imprisoned were in fact foreign-born. In fact, throughout the 19th century, it looks like there was a 2.5 to 3 times overrepresentation of impoverished immigrants in the prison population in the United States. So you're looking at 42 to 45% of prisoners in the U.S. in 1880 were foreign-born. In 1890, around 41% of prisoners in the United States were foreign-born. In the 1904 federal census of prisoners, between 38 and 40% of prisoners were foreign-born. That meant overwhelmingly white people, because that's who we were admitting. Before 1907, the deportation of criminal aliens was relatively rare. It required individual warrants with that request, and this generally did not happen prior to 1907. There was an Immigration Act, as I mentioned, in 1907, which made that easier. It's estimated that before 1900, only between 5 and 10% of people who had served a prison sentence were subsequently deported. And then between the periods of 1908 and 1914, it looks like between 30 and 50% of prisoners who served a sentence in the United States were then subsequently deported. In other words, the overwhelming majority of white immigrants, that is to say immigrants, to the United States in the 19th century and the early 20th century during peak migration into the U.S., who came to the U.S. and committed crimes and served a sentence, the overwhelming majority of them were just returned back to society once they served their sentence, just like everybody else. Them's were the rules. That's the way it happened. You may then get the counter argument of, well, what about the border? Because when you cross the border, well, what about the border? Because there really wasn't a U.S. Border Patrol until 1924. Actually, that was the act, that was the year that the act was passed that formed the United States Border Patrol, which again does not mean that people were hired and staffed and trained and that there was a functioning border patrol on either border. My other video regarding immigration goes into the cakewalk that the Canadian border was. Once American territory becomes American between the Louisiana Purchase and California, and there is a Mexican border to patrol, that's basically not happening for decades. It was considered common for the Mexican population to just wander across the U.S. border, and vice versa for Americans to wander into Mexico. It's estimated that between 300 and 500,000 Mexicans did that border crossing to either do some work in the United States frequently on railroads and return, or just stay, and nobody really had to stick up their butt about it. What's funny is there was at one point in the 1880s formed a 75-man border patrol on the U.S.-Mexican border that was specifically looking for Chinese immigrants who would come into Mexico and then perhaps try to cross the border into the United States. That was considered something to look out for. So you can picture that it's probably a white guy on a horse with a gun. There's only 75 of these guys for a border of more than 2,000 miles. They're not all on duty at the same time. And they're riding up and see a group of Mexicans who are walking across the border in search of work. And the guy on the horse says, okay, that's cool. They're Mexicans. Just as long as there aren't any of those Chinese. What I've been picturing in my head is the comedy team of Cheech and Chong trying to get across the border, and this would just split them up because Cheech Marin would still get to go to East LA, and Tommy Chong is getting returned probably fairly rudely. Now, I did find one group of people who were removed from the United States and effectively what you could call deported, depending on the year, at least forced to leave states, United States states, and forced into what were U.S. territories, and that would be Native Americans. Native Americans apparently came in the wrong way. Native Americans crossed a land bridge during a period when there was a geologic era which allowed such a thing, and did so in geologic time many thousands of years before Europeans were aware of the presence of the Americas. And those people apparently they crossed the wrong way. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 displaced over 60,000 people. There are estimates as high as 120,000 people to what is now the Western United States, to areas that they and their families had never been. And this would be a lot of people in eastern states who had been among the so-called 5 civilized tribes, and a lot of other native groups that were who were native to the eastern seaboard. So those people, we definitely decided, came in the wrong way. You gotta go. You gotta skedaddle. Get the hell out of here. We need room for Yosef the sheepshagger. He can button his fucking vest. So I hope that this provides you with some ammunition for your inevitable arguments with your idiot cousins and racist uncles around the dinner table this Thanksgiving, and really at any family gathering. I'm here to help. I'm a people pleaser. My name's Chris again, and I'd appreciate it if you enjoy these videos. They're not all going to be on immigration. I'm going to be looking at a lot of topics that I think are unjustly ignored, things that we know to be facts, but for whatever reasons choose not to emphasize. So until next time, folks, take it easy, enjoy yourselves, and you know what to do with the subscribe and like.